Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 65, the week ending August 11th, 2017, the Wichita Lineman Edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I, Mr. Monitors, return for a wide-ranging discussion on some of the week's top compliance and ethics-related stories, including the Mattis Memo on ethics and why it is so significant for the compliance practitioner. More data security compliance is on the EU horizon. We'll talk about an article in Risk and Compliance Journal of the Wall Street Journal by Mary Lemose-Stein about this new regulatory requirement on data and security. We pay tribute to Glen Campbell, who died this week, one of the great musicians in the second half of the 20th century. We discuss Matt Kelly's exploration of the intersection of FCPA and non-GAAP financial reporting. Jay asked if FCPA defense counsel are becoming whiny, based upon an article we detailed. Everything Compliance, episode 16 is out. It is our first book review episode. In it, we consider Jesse Eisinger's book, The Chickenshit Club, as a preview. Eisinger and key book source Paul Pelletier have agreed to come on the FCPA Compliance Report podcast to discuss the book early next month. This month's podcast series on 1 month to a more effective compliance program has premiered in August. This month, I review how to have a greater continuous improvement in compliance program. Affiliated Monitor is this month's sponsor. Jay pays tribute to me, actually, for surpassing 2,000 blog posts earlier this month. And then Jay discusses his weekend report. This is Tom Fox. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to This Week in FCPA, Episode 65 for the week ending August 11th, 2017, the Wichita Lineman Edition. As always, I'm joined by my colleague, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors. Jay, welcome.
Good morning, or actually it's good afternoon, Tom. We're gotten a little bit of a later start today, so I appreciate being more awake and ready to dive into This Week in FCPA.
Well, Jay, we have got several items to talk about it, so why don't we just hop right into it. The first thing I wanted to bring up, Jay, was at the end of last week, Secretary of Defense James Mattis released a memo on ethics, and Matt Kelly, our colleague, wrote about it on Radical Compliance this past Monday. And I found it to be one of the most significant statements on ethics that I've seen in quite some time. It was directed towards the military, obviously, as he's the Secretary of Defense. Nevertheless, I thought it's excellent tone, comment, language, and overall message for every compliance practitioner at a U.S. public company or a private company. So I was just really impressed by the memo, his requirement that each member of the Department of Defense had to play in the ethical midfield, his discussion around training and how the military would train itself to prepare itself and its subordinates for ethical dilemmas, and that it was the responsibility of senior officers, or really not just officers, non-coms as well, but all employees or military personnel would have to train those under them. So all the way down the chain. It was just a stunning memo. It was I thought it was so powerful. I wrote about it on Tuesday and or Wednesday of this week as well. So lots really to unpack. I've cited to both Matt and I cited to the full memo if anyone wants to read it, and I urge every compliance practitioner to read it. So from your perspective, what did you see in it?
Well, it's really about talking the talk and walking the walk. And I think what I really loved about it, and you commented on this in your blog post, was the way that he signs off. And he signs off, quote, "I am proud to work alongside you." And the point that you make is, when was the last time that you saw a CEO or COO, for that matter, end a communication with those words. So not only does the general feel it's important to have this tone for the top, but he's actually puts himself in the same boots as those soldiers who he's fighting alongside with. So I think it really does, underline his commitment to ethics. And the other point that you made was this is a very succinct and targeted communications, comes in around 250 words. So it's not going to put anybody to sleep. If you read this, you should retain the information and you should know what needs to be done.
And it's short. I'm glad you brought that point up because it is short and succinct. But within that short succinctness of 250 words, I found about 4 or 5 key points in the memo. And really, for every compliance practitioner, I would, or if you're a CCO, the next time you're in front of the board, I'd put this entire memo up in front of the board and just go through it and explain how it ties into your program and to a best practices compliance program. So just a really powerful memo, certainly for me, from Secretary Mattis. As I said, both Matt and I have written about it. So you can get a copy of it and you can get our thoughts, Matt, on obviously radical compliance and myself on my side as well. So next, we have more data security compliance on the EU horizon, Jay. Mara Lemos-Stein at Risk and Corruption at the Wall Street Journal wrote a piece this week about new additional data protections that are coming into place. It's called the Network and Information Systems Directive. This is in addition to what Jonathan Armstrong has talked quite a bit about, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which comes into effect next May. And the NIS directive requires that all countries have a strategy in place to support the security of networks for their vital industries, and calls for a cross-border group for information sharing on the risks and breaches of cybersecurity. For our U.S. listeners, I think it's going to be the same sort of requirements as GDPR. If you're doing business in Europe and the EU and probably in the UK, you are going to need to have demonstrated compliance with this memorandum at network and information system security, in addition to data privacy. So the data bar is, I think, going to go up in the EU by law. And if you're a multinational company, you're going to have to comply with that law.
So from my perspective, this is just the best practice that a company needs to do. And with the fact that, there are so many potential for cyber attacks, you would want to do this on your own. But my question is with all these regulations coming out of the EU, do we think that some of this is maybe Y2K meets conflict minerals, and you're going to have a lot of people spending time and jumping through regulatory hoops? But I'm not really sure. If they're not doing it for themselves, why would they do it to do business in the EU?
Well, I think as to Y2K, that ended on a date certain. Conflicts minerals, I think, has been overturned or revoked by the Trump administration. I don't see the EU having the situational ethics of the current U.S. administration in terms of revoking regulatory requirements that that came out of the Dodd-Frank Act. So my sense is that, one, this will be the law in the EU going forward. And I guess the thing I would see, Jay, is that if a company is doing business in EU countries, it's one more regulation they're going to have to comply with. But you correctly note that it's a good business practice. So, perhaps the answer is a business solution to a legal problem. And the business solution is to have a network security plan and program in place as a business practice, just as you would have a compliance program in place to do business under the FCPA here in the United States.
I like that answer. I don't know, I just felt contrarian for a sec, so I thought I'd throw that out. Next up, you're going to talk about just another wonderful musician who we've lost this year, and the reason why the podcast today is credited to the Wichita Linemen. So why don't you tell us about Glen Campbell?
Sure. So Glen Campbell, hopefully most people know who Glen Campbell now was, but he was one of the true great musicians of the second half of the 20th century. He was a guitar player extraordinaire. He was a session player in Los Angeles who broke out as a singer. He had a string of #1 hits, Wichita Lineman, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Galveston, are just some of the ones that come to mind. He perhaps achieved international fame as the Rhinestone Cowboy, which I have to say is not my personal favorite, but it propelled him into a stratosphere. He later had very public struggles with drugs and alcohol and cleaned himself up. And at the end of his life, had a very public struggle with dementia and Alzheimer's. And there was a movie made about his final tour and album while he was really in the throes of early onset dementia. And it really publicized that very, very horrible disease. I watched it. It was extraordinarily difficult to watch because you could see his deterioration, but very public. And I think he did a great service by putting that forward in the transparent manner that he did. But really one of the great musicians, could play anything from bluegrass. He would toured with the Beach Boys, my favorite story. He was a Beach Boy once. He started on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, for those who might remember that. He then had his own show on CBS, the Glen Campbell Variety Show. He was in movies. He was in the original True Grit and sang the theme song from the original True Grit. So a true American, son of a sharecropper from Delight, Arkansas. Had a practice law with a fellow who's from Delight once, so he knew Glenn. And just a great, an American original.
So in your blog post, you used that as a jumping off point to talk about an interview with, I guess, what is it, the CEO of Lyft? Were there any lessons you wanted to share from that?
Well, now you're going to force me to pull that up.
Sorry, I don't mean to make you work. It's a Friday.
Amen. So the obviously Lyft is the major competitor to Uber. So it's going to be interesting to see what how Lyft shakes out with all of the turmoil around Uber. And we've now had the former CEO, Travis Kalanick, has been personally sued by one of the major shareholders in Uber. So that's always never a good sign. But the CEO at Lyft is a fellow named John Zimmer. And John Zimmer really had, I thought, some interesting lessons around letting people know your weaknesses and hire better people than you around you. And that's not a message many business leaders or even CCOs talk about a lot. So several different points, but that was really one of the ones that stuck with me from the interview I read of John Zimmer. But it was really an excellent piece, and it's going to be interesting to see where Lyft takes itself with its very different values. The business model, I think, is similar to Uber, but the values of Lyft are very different. They treat their employees very differently, and they put a very different public face going forward. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes as well. So let's jump to an article that you flagged for us, Jay. And the article is entitled, DOJ Must Beware of Unintended Consequences as Multilateral Settlements Rise. Why don't you give us your thoughts on that?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. So this caught my eye. I picked this article up through GIR, Global Investigations Review. And it was an article written by a couple partners at Jenner and Block, David Bitcower, the criminal division's former second in command, and Nicholas Barnaby, and they had support from an associate named Marguerite Muller, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And they argue that multilateral investigations could increase the DOJ's leverage in settlement negotiations and lead to unfair consequences for companies. And I guess I have to say boo-hoo, because if I'm understanding their argument, they're saying that it's bad to have multilateral investigations, it's worse to have multilateral settlements, and it's most egregious giving a company offset credits. So I guess I am feeling rather feisty today, but what am I missing here? If I always thought it was a good thing for global authorities to try to root out corruption, and an idea that started here in the US, and due to a lot of cross-training between the DOJ and the Bureau and our counterparts across the world, we've now trained within the last generation people who are able to go out and investigate and look for corruption. So if we don't have to take the lead on it anymore, and if a company like Odebrecht is going to be paying the majority of the fines to the locus to Brazil where the corruption happened, I don't see a problem. So, Tom, am I just not getting enough brand today, or what is my issue?
Maybe you need to. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. You might need to go back and rebrand with a big bowl of bran flakes. But no, I guess I looked at it from a little bit different perspective, Jay. But it started with something that you touched on, which is if you engage in bribery and corruption, anywhere in the world, you have violated some country's laws. If you're a U.S. company subject to the FCPA, obviously you violated the FCPA. But every country in the world has a law which says you cannot bribe our government officials. And so you've now violated the laws, domestic laws of a country rather, and you may have violated the Brazilian Clean Company Act, the UK Bribery Act, Sapon II in France, or innumerable other anti-bribery, anti-corruption laws with an international focus. So one, you're going to be liable, as you should be in those jurisdictions. The point that you could be subject to multiple fines and penalties, absolutely. If you engage in legal actions or engage in actions which violate multiple laws, you bet. But the answer is not really to whine about it. I think the answer was really laid out most starkly by Kara Brockmeyer last November at the ACI National FCPA Conference, where she and Dan Kahn were on a panel, and they talked about this, and they talked about the one pie concept, and that what the U.S. government and U.S. regulators were doing was moving towards one pie of fines and penalties, and that pie would be split up by negotiations by the countries, but the basis of the negotiation would be, as you suggested, the locus of the investigation and the locus of the criminal activity. So it makes sense for the majority of Odebrecht to be paid in Brazil. It made sense for the majority of Rolls-Royce to be paid in the United Kingdom. And there's frankly never going to be an international agreement between sovereign nations where they cede rights to obtain full legal remedies for violations. That doesn't mean that they won't give an offset or they won't agree to the one pie concept, but that's the way it works in practice, and you're not ever going to get countries to agree to that. And to ask the Department of Justice or even claim that you need to write that into some statute or regulation or rulemaking authority that you have to give an offset, Congress would never approve of that. Because they don't want to tie the hands of the Department of Justice for somebody that violates a U.S. law, even if that U.S. law is the FCPA. The answer is, as Kara and Dan noted, is to self-disclose, turn over information and cooperate during the investigation, extensively remediate, and then negotiate your fine and penalty. And then have the parties agree, to the extent possible, agree on one pie or one fine and penalty, and then let the regulators split that pie and penalty up. Is that perfect? Is it going to give the same certainty and same answer every time? The answer to that's no. But every country has the right to enforce its own laws. And simply because you've paid a fine and penalty in Brazil, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, you name the country, that does not mean that the United States Department of Justice can or even should give full credit to that fine or offset that amount. So I really found that part of their argument very lacking and non-persuasive.
One other quickie, if you can address it, they also talk about the potential for venue shopping. Did their argument sway you on that as well?
Well, the argument on venue shopping presupposes that there is a locked up resource of information that would only go to that one venue. Once you self-disclose in one country, that country most probably will share that information with someone else. If so, and that would be the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, whoever they had a relationship with. So I don't see, as a practical matter, how you would ever forum shop or venue shop. I think that probably the best thing would be to self-disclose across the board, but certainly make the Department of Justice and SEC aware as early as possible, because they are going to be your largest advocates for the one pie concept. And you want the U.S. regulators to understand that you have cooperated with all other jurisdictions, and simply running to Nigeria or running to Kazakhstan or running to you name the country because you think you're going to get a better deal there. That works in South Texas when you're filing lawsuits, but I don't think it works in international enforcement regimes for corruption.
Cool. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. So unfortunately, even though I went to a somewhat reputable business school, I got C's in accounting, so I'm going to have to throw this one over to you. Our good friend Matt Kelly of Radical Compliance talks about when non-GAAP reporting meets FCPA.
So right, Matt wrote about Maxwell Technologies, who's had their own sort of FCPA journey going forward, and that they had certain expenses that they listed in non-GAAP revenue. And kind of Matt's point was in that, didn't you go to, wasn't it a trade school I think you went to? It was called Pen Trade or Trade Pen, something like that.
Something like that. I mean, I'm on the diploma. It says the Wharton School of Business.
But, okay. Well, my mistake.
It's not Michigan or Texas or any of those big schools.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, my accounting is perhaps even my accounting degrees are even less than yours. Nevertheless, when you have a non-GAAP revenue, the problem for people like me is I've been taught all my life about GAAP, which are the general accepted accounting principles. And when you start talking about some other system or non-GAAP, I, as in Tom Fox, don't understand how you can compare it and how you would, how an investor would take a look at it. And Matt's written a series of posts about non-GAAP accounting. And the basic point I get is when you use non-GAAP accounting, you're talking in a different language. And should you be able to report your financials in a non-GAAP accounting method and have non-GAAP economic income when it's only accepted that GAAP be used for accounting? So it's not exactly a way to play tricks, because you do have to reconcile between non-GAAP and GAAP at some point. Matt cited a couple of examples. One was OXIF, which did reconcile. Avon did, but you had to look into the footnotes to find it rather than a line-by-line tabular presentation that Maxwell Technologies, for instance, used. So it just makes things more difficult to understand. And that's really what I got out of it.
So from the non-accounting part, did I get out of the article that Matt was also saying that to some point there are lingering costs involved with FCPA investigations, and some of those costs may even impact the balance sheet after a settlement. So I think that it's a good idea to track those information questions, but they're usually buried in footnotes, I think.
Right. So if you want to geek out on some non-GAAP reporting, we've linked in the show notes over to Matt's piece. Head on over there and check it out.
All right, a company that you know well, Halliburton. What did Stephen Smart say about them?
Well, Stephen Smart really continued the discussion about Halliburton and the recent FCPA enforcement action. And it really shows how that case has continued to resonate in the eyes of compliance officers. So I can pull that up. Stephen really wrote about it from the perspective of Halliburton being a repeat FCPA offender, and that the internal controls failures led to the current enforcement action by the SEC in late July. And he emphasized the need to have compliance oversight into third parties that the company brings in, because in the Halliburton's case, the third party which got the company into trouble was not brought in as a commercial agent with regular compliance, oversight, and due diligence. It came in as a vendor, and apparently the violating Halliburton's internal controls and not having an appropriate level of oversight. So showing how this case continued to resonate, and this is going to stay in the public eye, I guess.
I think what I took away from that was kind of interesting. There's a paragraph that says, while the friendship may have resulted in some indirect benefit to the government official from Halliburton's decision to hire this local partner, this is far from clear. The selection of the business partner seems to have been based on his previous employment with Halliburton, not his friendship with the government official. So in the past, when you are doing procurement checks, you're looking for, are they a relative? Are they an uncle? Are they a spouse? So this part of the story seems a little bit more tenuous. I mean, is friendship a relationship that we can normally uncover when you're going through the third-party due diligence process?
It's pretty difficult. There's going to be no written record on it, and you would certainly, maybe you could get people to disclose that, but at least when you're doing family relationship, you have some degree of consanguinity. You rarely have that sort of definitional certainty when it comes to friendship.
But I mean, if you and I were watching a Rockets game, would you acknowledge that you're a friend of mine? Well, I mean, if the Celtics Rockets, I hope I said that.
Depends on who was winning.
Okay.
Even more situational ethics.
Yeah, but I think at the end it does make my takeaway from it is the final paragraph that when you are doing due diligence, it's not only important to look at financial controls, but you need to look at controls from a non-finance perspective, so especially procurement controls. And if there's a workaround that you can end up hiring your buddy or your friend and it doesn't get vetted by the other controls within your company, then there's a big risk there.
Absolutely. Still lessons to be not only resonating, but lessons to be learned. Okay,
so sports keeps coming back. If any people are baseball geeks like you and I, we know that with sabermetrics, there's a lot of emphasis and focus on numbers. And one of the numbers that means a lot towards the longevity of a player's career is the number of 3,000 hits. It's a very exclusive club. And recently, Tom joined a very exclusive club by writing his 2000th blog. And earlier this week, he published how he got into blogging and what some of his famous blogs were. So I was wondering if you might give us a little insight into that, Tom.
So yeah, I think I'm behind Dick Casson. I think he was he's never listed how many he's done, but I'm sure it's well over 2,000 because, as we know from last week, he's been doing it 10 years. It took me 4 years to get through my first 1,000 and about 2.5 to get through the second 1,000. It's because I blog a lot. I blog at Compliance Week. I blog now twice a day on my site. So, the numbers have increased. And the thing I would just share with people is two things. One is maybe three, because I'm a good lawyer, so I talk in threes. One is that the people who encouraged me to do it, Dick Casson was one, Francine McKenna, who now works at MarketWatch, Dow Jones publication, was incredibly supportive. Scott Moritz was a friend I met early, or acquaintance I made early on, who's become a good friend throughout this process, and all of them were very supportive. I have tried to be supportive for others who have come into to the blogging world. Probably my biggest mentee was Matt Ellis. I guess he still blogs, but before he went back to Miller, he really had an active blog site, and I really encouraged Matt to go down the road of blogging and really focus on Latin America. But with blogging and the work in compliance, I think you probably evidence this as well as anybody, Jay, that the more you give away, the more you get back. So that's really one of the key lessons, key insights I had. Second, that if you really want to learn something, write about it because you've got to research it. And then for me, it's really a love. I love writing. I love blogging. I love podcasting. I love being in compliance. So I don't want to say it's a labor of love because that implies it's work. And I hardly consider doing what I do work. So it's just I love doing it and love writing. And I'm looking forward to having joining the very exclusive 3,000 Hits Club. I'm not sure I'll ever overtake Casson, but maybe he'll retire one day. But it's been a lot of fun.
I just wanted to echo your sentiments and thank you for your mentoring. And you're absolutely correct that the people who are passionate about compliance and ethics and anti-corruption, it's a wonderful community, and it really is a peoplehood, a brotherhood, a sisterhood. And there's been so many interesting relationships that I've initially forged with people virtually, and then when you have the opportunity to meet with them in person and reconnect, it really is a pleasure.
So do you have let's talk about the 1 month podcast series I'm doing this month. 1 month to a more it's not effective compliance program. It's 1 month to greater
continuous improvement.
And it's sponsored by Affiliated Monitor. So thank you for that sponsorship. It's been a lot of fun. I had the chance to visit with Vin and Eric from Jay's company, and some of their thoughts are going to be in some of my podcasts and posts this month. So thank you very much for that sponsorship. Do you have a weekend report in mind this weekend, Jay?
Tom, not only do I have a weekend report in mind, but it's already been posted too. So you can find it on my LinkedIn account. And the title is, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? If you recall, around the holidays when we had certain uncertainty about how the new administration was going to handle the FCPA, I got a little bit musical and quoted The Clash and said, should I stay or should I go? So if you're so inclined, please take a look at my blog, and it talks about similar themes that Tom just addressed about the vibrant FCPA and ethics and compliance community, which we're all a part of.
So we'll link to that in the show notes as well, since you published it before the weekend.
Yeah, let's see if we can make that happen 2 weeks in a row.
Well, Jay, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I was wondering if you might take us home this week.
Sure. For Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for spending some time with us this weekend and looking at the FCPA week that was for the week ending August 11th, 2017.
Hello again, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate us, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the only weekly FCPA and compliance-related podcast. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jay at jarosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you will join us again next week for another episode of This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.